In today's audiobook, we explore Burnout, the silent unraveling at the heart of the slow collapse of everything fine, published by Stillness Audiobooks. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, inviting you to reflect deeply on what this theme truly means in your own life, not as a clinical diagnosis, not as a productivity problem to be solved, but as a deeply human experience, one that has been quietly building, perhaps for longer than you have allowed yourself to acknowledge. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a dramatic event, a crisis, a clear breaking point. It arrives gradually, almost politely, slipping into the ordinary rhythms of your days until one morning you wake up and realize that the version of yourself who once felt capable, curious and alive seems to have gone somewhere you cannot quite locate. The coffee no longer helps the way it used to. The meetings blur into one another. You smile in the right places. You deliver. And yet something essential has quietly dimmed. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is what happens when a human being gives more than the deepest reserves of themselves, consistently, invisibly, often without even realizing it is happening. What you are about to hear is not a lecture. It is not a list of strategies. It is something closer to a long, unhurried conversation about what burnout actually is, where it truly comes from, and what it quietly asks of those who have lived through it. Throughout this audiobook, we will move through 6 chapters, each one illuminating a different layer of this experience. In the first chapter, we explore the origins of burnout, not in workload alone, but in something far older and more personal. In the second, we examine the internal mechanism that keeps exhaustion invisible until it is already profound. In the third chapter, we look at how burnout reshapes the texture of daily life in ways that are easy to misread or dismiss. The fourth chapter turns toward the hidden patterns, the beliefs, the identities, the quiet agreements we have made with ourselves that feed the collapse long before we feel it. In the fifth chapter, we begin to sense what a natural return might look like, not a recovery in the conventional sense, but something more honest. And in the sixth and final chapter, we explore what life looks like on the other side, not as a fixed destination, but as a different relationship with oneself. If you are someone who has been told you simply need to rest or push through or be more grateful, this audiobook was written for you. If you have sensed that something is not quite right, but could not find the words for it, these chapters may offer some of that language. And if you are simply exhausted in a way that feels bigger than tiredness, you are exactly where you need to be. Let us dive into the root of this, chapter by chapter. Before we begin, if what you hear today resonates with you, consider following the Stillness Audiobooks channel. New original audiobooks arrive every week, crafted for quiet listening, for the drives, the evenings, the moments between the noise. Chapter 1. The Root Beneath the Ruin. There is a common assumption about burnout that it begins with too much work, that if a person simply had fewer responsibilities, shorter hours, a lighter calendar, the whole problem would dissolve. And while the volume of demands certainly plays a role, this explanation is incomplete in a way that matters enormously. Because many people carry extraordinary loads without burning out, while others collapse under what appears from the outside to be a manageable life. The difference rarely lies in the workload itself. It lies somewhere deeper in the relationship a person has with what they are doing, and more precisely, in the relationship they have with themselves. Burnout, in its truest form, is not simply the result of working too much. It is the result of working too long in the absence of something essential, a sense of meaning, of recognition, of alignment between what one does and who one believes oneself to be. When that alignment is present, effort feels generative, even when it is demanding. When it is absent, even modest effort begins to feel like a withdrawal from a bank account that no one is refilling. Consider for a moment the person who first accepted the demanding role, the long hours, the constant availability, the blurred evenings. In the beginning, there was often something real driving them, a sense of purpose, a desire to prove something, a belief that the sacrifice was temporary, that it would lead somewhere meaningful. These are not small motivations. They are the kind that can carry a person through extraordinary difficulty. But over time, if the destination never arrives, if the goalposts keep moving, if the recognition never comes, if the meaning begins to feel hollow, the same energy that once felt like fuel begins to feel like something being extracted. What makes this particularly difficult to see in real time is that the extraction is gradual. It does not happen all at once. It happens in increments so small that each individual moment seems manageable. One more late evening, one more commitment accepted, one more boundary quietly retreated from. None of these moments taken alone feels catastrophic, but they accumulate, and in their accumulation, they form the slow collapse named in the title of this book. There is also something important in the word slow, because burnout is not a sudden break. It is a long erosion, like a coastline shaped by years of tides rather than a single storm, and this erosion is often invisible to the person experiencing it, precisely because they are inside it. The frog in the gradually warming water, as the expression goes, does not feel the danger because the change comes in degrees too small to register as an alarm. What lies at the root of this, beneath the exhaustion and the disconnection, is often a set of deeply held beliefs about what it means to be valuable, worthy, or enough. For many people who experience burnout, there is a quiet, rarely examined conviction that their worth is tied to their output, that to rest is to fall behind, that to say no is to disappoint, that to need something is to be a burden. These beliefs are rarely conscious. They operate in the background, like a program running silently on a device, consuming resources without ever appearing on the screen. This is where the root truly lives, not in the calendar, not in the inbox, but in the quiet architecture of beliefs that was built long before the career began, long before the pressure accumulated. Understanding this does not immediately change everything, but it is the beginning of seeing clearly. And seeing clearly, as we will explore throughout these chapters, is the first and most essential step in any genuine recovery. This naturally leads us to examine what happens inside, the invisible mechanism that allows exhaustion to grow so quietly, so persistently, that by the time it is felt, it has already become profound. Chapter 2. The Invisible Engine. One of the most disorienting aspects of burnout is how long it can remain invisible, not just to others but to the person living through it. There is a particular kind of high-functioning exhaustion that looks from the outside almost indistinguishable from health. Meetings are attended, deadlines are met, the face is composed, the emails are answered. And yet, beneath this surface, a very different process is unfolding, one of quiet depletion, of systems running on reserves that are no longer being replenished. Understanding why this invisibility is so persistent requires looking at the internal engine that keeps it running. And at the center of that engine, many observe, is adaptation, the extraordinary human capacity to adjust to new baselines so smoothly that the adjustment itself goes unnoticed. When a person first begins to experience the early signals of burnout, the slight flatness in the mornings, the subtle loss of enthusiasm for things that once felt engaging, the growing sense that weekends are never quite long enough, these signals are real. They are the nervous system's honest communication. But because they arrive gradually, and because the demands of life continue regardless, most people adapt. They find workarounds. They drink more coffee. They push through the flatness. They tell themselves this is a busy season that will pass, and in doing so, they move their baseline downward without ever registering the movement as a loss. This process repeats. The new lower baseline becomes the new normal, more adaptation, more adjustment, more quiet convincing of oneself that this is simply what life feels like now. What was once a warning signal becomes background noise, and background noise, by its very nature, is no longer heard as a signal. There is also a second mechanism at work, one that many observe in people who are particularly conscientious, particularly driven, particularly committed to not letting others down. It is the mechanism of self-suppression. The quiet act of not allowing oneself to fully feel what is being felt, because feeling it would mean having to respond to it. Because responding to it would mean acknowledging that something needs to change. And acknowledging that something needs to change can feel to certain kinds of people like admitting a failure they are not yet willing to own. Imagine a professional, someone deeply committed to their work, proud of their reliability, known in their team for never dropping the ball. Over 18 months, the demands of their role have quietly expanded. Their evenings are no longer their own. Their weekends have become extensions of the working week. And yet they tell themselves, repeatedly, that this is temporary, that things will settle. They suppress the tiredness because acknowledging it feels like weakness. They suppress the resentment because feeling resentful feels ungrateful. And they suppress the grief, yes, grief, because there is real loss accumulating. Lost time, lost energy, lost versions of who they wanted to be. This suppression is not a character flaw. It is, in many cases, the logical consequence of having learned, somewhere along the way, that one's value depends on one's resilience, that to feel the cost of things is to be failing at the game of coping. And so the feelings go underground, but they do not disappear. They accumulate. And in their accumulation, they add a second layer of exhaustion to the first. Not just the physical fatigue of overwork, but the psychic fatigue of managing the experience of overwork. This is the invisible engine of burnout, not simply the demands themselves, but the adaptation to the demands, and the suppression of the signals that something is wrong. Together, these two mechanisms create a system that is self-perpetuating and, crucially, self-concealing. Which is why burnout so often arrives as a surprise, not because there were no signals, but because the signals were learned not to be trusted. Let us now consider how this internal process begins to reshape the external texture of daily life, often in ways that are subtle, easy to misread, and surprisingly easy to mistake for other things entirely. Chapter 3. The changed texture of days. When burnout has settled in, not as a crisis but as a sustained condition, it does not announce itself with a single dramatic symptom. Instead, it works quietly on the quality of ordinary experience. It changes the texture of days in ways that are difficult to name precisely, and therefore difficult to address directly. Things that once had flavor begin to feel flat. Relationships that once felt nourishing begin to feel effortful. The capacity for spontaneity, for genuine curiosity, for the small pleasures that once stitched the day together, these begin to quietly recede. Many describe it as a kind of graying, not depression in the clinical sense, though the overlap is real and worth acknowledging, something more like a dimming of the saturation in life. Colors are still present, but they are muted. Food is eaten, but not quite tasted. Conversations are had, but not fully inhabited. There is a persistent sense of going through the motions, of being present in a technical sense, while something essential remains somewhere else, somewhere just out of reach. The relationship with time also shifts in a particular way. Hours that are not spent working often feel purposeless, because the identity has become so tightly braided with productivity that the absence of output leaves a strange, uncomfortable vacuum. Rest does not feel like rest. It feels like lost time, like guilt wearing comfortable clothes. And so the person who is already exhausted cannot fully use the moments available for recovery, because those moments are shadowed by the sense that they should be doing something. Consider an evening at home, a professional, back from a day that left them hollow, sitting on the sofa with a film they chose specifically because they wanted to switch off, and yet their mind is elsewhere. Going over a conversation from the afternoon, composing the email they will send in the morning, half present, half already back at work. The body is resting, but the nervous system has not received the message. Rest is happening in theory. Recovery is not. This fractured quality of attention is one of the most distinctive features of the burnout state. The mind, long trained to remain vigilant, long practiced in the anticipation of the next demand, cannot simply be switched off by proximity to leisure. It has learned a certain posture, one of readiness, of preparation, of low-level alertness, And it maintains that posture even when no threat is present, even when objectively there is nowhere to be and nothing required. Sleep is often affected in ways that deepen the exhaustion further. Falling asleep may be difficult because the same mind that cannot settle in the evening cannot settle at night, or sleep comes easily from pure exhaustion but does not feel restorative. The person wakes tired, as though the hours of unconsciousness did not actually replenish what was spent. And so the day begins already behind, already running a deficit, already calling on reserves that are no longer there. What changes most profoundly, perhaps, is the relationship with other people. Not because the people in one's life have changed, but because the available capacity for connection has contracted. Conversations that require genuine presence feel draining rather than energizing. Social events that were once pleasurable now require a kind of performance. The effort of appearing engaged when the interior experience is one of absence. Close relationships sometimes suffer not from conflict, but from a quiet withdrawal that the burned-out person may not fully recognize in themselves, and that others may misread as coldness or indifference. This is the changed texture of days, not dramatic, not crisis, but profoundly different from what life once felt like. And recognizing this texture, naming it honestly, is an act of courage. It is also, as we will discover in the next chapter, only the beginning of understanding what is truly driving it. Chapter 4. The patterns we carry without knowing. At this point in our exploration, we have looked at where burnout begins, how it sustains itself invisibly, and what it does to the quality of daily life. But there is a layer beneath all of this that deserves particular attention, one that is rarely addressed in conversations about exhaustion, and yet one that may be the most significant of all. It is the layer of hidden patterns, the deep psychological habits, the quietly held beliefs, the unexamined agreements a person has made with themselves about who they must be in order to be acceptable. These patterns do not begin in adulthood. They are learned early, in the environments where we first understood what was required of us. Some people learn very young that love and approval are conditional on performance, that being good means being useful, that being valued means not needing too much, that one's place in the family or the classroom or the community depends on a certain kind of effortful goodness. These lessons are rarely taught explicitly. They are absorbed through the texture of experience, through what was praised and what was not, through what was noticed and what was overlooked, through the quiet calculus of belonging. And then life begins, and careers begin, and the same patterns that governed childhood quietly transfer to the professional world. The child who learned that effort equals love becomes the adult who cannot say no to an additional responsibility. The child who learned that visibility comes through achievement becomes the professional who defines their worth by their output. The child who learned that needing things is a burden becomes the person who never asks for help, who absorbs more than their share without complaint, who genuinely does not register how much they are carrying, because to register it would require acknowledging a need they have long since learned to suppress. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illuminates something important. That burnout is not simply a modern productivity problem. It is, in many cases, an ancient psychological pattern meeting a modern environment that is perfectly designed to amplify it. The always-on culture, the metrics, the performance reviews, the relentless optimization. These things do not create the pattern, but they give it endless fuel. And here is where the comment becomes most important to leave, most vital to write. If you are listening to this, and something in these words is landing somewhere particular, somewhere personal, consider sharing what you are experiencing in the comments below. What pattern do you recognize in yourself? What quiet agreement have you been living by without examining it? The words others share in spaces like this one have a way of creating something valuable, the recognition that you are not alone in this, and never were. Many observe that one of the most powerful hidden patterns in burnout is what might be called the identity fusion, the point at which a person's sense of self has become so completely merged with their role, their performance, their professional identity, that the idea of stepping back feels not like rest but like erasure. If I am not working, who am I? If I am not producing, what is my value? These questions, rarely spoken aloud, operate as a kind of underground gravity, pulling a person back toward effort, even when every signal in their body is asking for stillness. There is also the pattern of postponed living, the quiet belief that the real life, the nourishing life, the life one actually wants, is waiting somewhere on the other side of the next achievement, the next milestone, the next season of hard work. Once I get through this quarter, once the project is delivered, once I get the promotion, once things settle down, and things never quite settle down, because the pattern that created the postponement is still active, and it will always find a new threshold to cross before living can begin. Recognizing these patterns, not with self-judgment, but with genuine curiosity, is the beginning of something different. It does not undo the exhaustion overnight, but it changes the question. Instead of asking, how do I cope better with this life, the question begins to become, is this the life I actually chose, or is it the life that the pattern chose for me? This naturally leads us to what a genuine path forward might look like. Not a recovery program, not a set of techniques, but something more honest and more lasting. Chapter 5. The long way back to yourself. There is a particular kind of advice that circulates around burnout that, while well-intentioned, often misses the depth of what is actually required. Take a vacation. Meditate for 10 minutes each morning. Set clearer boundaries, delegate more. These suggestions are not without value. But offered in isolation, without the deeper understanding we have been building throughout these chapters, they tend to address the surface of the problem while leaving the root untouched. A person returns from vacation restored, and within 2 weeks, the same patterns have reasserted themselves. The meditation practice is abandoned by the 3rd week because there is no time. The boundaries are set and then quietly eroded by the same forces, internal and external, that eroded them before. The long way back to oneself is not a shortcut. It is, as the phrase suggests, long, and it begins not with doing but with a quality of seeing, an honest, unhurried willingness to look at what is actually happening without immediately rushing to fix it. There is something important in this pause before the action, because the impulse to immediately find a solution is itself often part of the same pattern that created the problem. The belief that if we simply optimize enough, adjust enough, try hard enough at recovery, we can solve our way out of this, is the burnout mind attempting to cope with burnout by using the very strategies that burned it out. What the long way back looks like is different for every person. But common to most genuine recoveries, as observed across many human experiences, is a gradual process of re-permission, the slow, sometimes uncomfortable practice of allowing oneself to need what one actually needs. Rest without the guilt, space without filling it immediately. The acknowledgement that a slower pace for a time is not a failure of ambition, but a biological necessity. Consider someone who, after years of relentless output, finds themselves genuinely unable to continue at the same pace, not burned out dramatically, not hospitalized, but simply empty. They take 2 weeks away from their role, and for the first several days they feel worse, not better. The absence of structure, the silence where the busyness used to be, the unfamiliar sensation of having nowhere to be, these feel deeply uncomfortable. Because the nervous system that has been trained to run at a certain frequency does not immediately know what to do with stillness. Stillness, at first, can feel like failure, but then, slowly, something begins to shift. The body, given enough consecutive hours of actual rest, begins to remember what it feels like to be undepleted. Small things begin to return, a flicker of genuine interest in something unrelated to work, a moment of laughter that comes from somewhere real rather than somewhere performed. The appetite returns, not just for food, but for experience. These are not dramatic events. They are quiet ones. But they are significant because they are the organism reorienting toward what it actually needs, given half a chance to do so. The long way back also involves a renegotiation with the patterns described in the previous chapter. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a gradual loosening, the beginning of asking different questions. What would it look like to do this differently? What would I choose if I believed my needs were as valid as the needs of everyone I have been trying not to disappoint? What does my body tell me in the morning before the day's requirements override its signal? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of life do I actually want now that I am beginning to see the one I have been living with clearer eyes? These are not questions with immediate answers. They are questions that deserve to be lived with slowly, returned to repeatedly, allowed to gradually reshape the choices that follow. This is what the long way back looks like. Not a program, not a protocol, but a deepening relationship with oneself, honest, patient, and ultimately more sustainable than anything that has come before. Chapter 6. A different kind of aliveness. There is a version of recovery from burnout that looks, from the outside, like a return to normal. The energy comes back. The capacity for work returns. The person is functioning again, meeting expectations, present in their relationships. And from a certain perspective, this is recovery. The acute phase has passed. The deficit has been addressed, at least partially. Life resumes. But there is another kind of recovery, one that goes deeper than the restoration of function, one that uses the experience of collapse not merely as a problem to be solved, but as information. As an invitation to understand oneself differently, to construct a life more honestly aligned with what one actually needs and values, rather than what one has spent years believing was required. This second kind of recovery is rarer. It is also, many observe, the one that lasts. What emerges from this deeper kind of recovery is not simply the absence of exhaustion, it is a different relationship with energy itself. A person who has genuinely reckoned with burnout, who has looked at the patterns, examined the beliefs, grieved the losses, and begun to live with greater honesty about their own needs, often discovers something unexpected, that life, lived at a pace that is actually sustainable, has a quality of aliveness in it that the relentless pace never did. This is perhaps counterintuitive. The common assumption is that slowing down means achieving less, experiencing less, becoming less. But many who have traversed this territory describe the opposite, that the quality of their attention improves when their attention is no longer perpetually divided, that the pleasure in ordinary things, a conversation, a meal, an evening without agenda, returns when they are no longer mentally halfway somewhere else, that their relationships deepen when they are genuinely present in them, rather than performing presence while their mind remains elsewhere. There is also something that might be called a different relationship with enoughness. The pattern of postponed living, of always working toward the threshold beyond which real life would begin, gradually gives way to something more immediate. The recognition that this moment, this ordinary Tuesday with its small textures and its imperfect light, is not the waiting room for the real thing. It is the real thing. And the capacity to inhabit it fully, not in a forced aspirational way, but naturally, because the nervous system has been given enough room to settle, is one of the quiet gifts that burnout, paradoxically, sometimes leaves behind. This is not to romanticize the experience of collapse. Burnout is a genuine loss. It costs real things: time, relationships, health, versions of oneself that may not fully return. These losses deserve to be acknowledged, not reframed into positivity. But alongside the loss, there is often something found, a clarity that the pace before the collapse did not allow for, an honesty about what actually matters that was harder to access when everything was moving too fast. A different kind of aliveness, then, is not a triumphant rebirth. It is quieter than that. It is the experience of waking up in the morning and feeling, not every morning, not perfectly, but genuinely and increasingly, that there is something to be present for. That the day ahead holds real texture, that the self showing up for that day is one that is recognized, valued, and no longer running on empty. It is, in the end, the experience of coming back, not to the version of yourself that burned out. That version was already a departure from something more essential, but back to something older and quieter, the self that exists beneath the performance, beneath the output, beneath the relentless effort to be enough. That self was always there. It simply needed the noise to stop long enough to be heard again. Conclusion. Throughout these chapters, we have seen that burnout is not a simple story of working too much. It is a layered human experience, rooted in beliefs that often predate the career, sustained by invisible mechanisms of adaptation and self-suppression, expressed in the quiet graying of daily life, and driven by patterns that operate largely beneath conscious awareness. We have seen that the path back is not a shortcut, and that the deepest recoveries are not merely functional, but transformational, reshaping not just the schedule, but the relationship a person has with themselves. What does this mean for your journey? Perhaps you have recognized something in these chapters, a pattern, a texture, a habit of thought that feels familiar. Perhaps the words have named something that had been present, but unspoken. If so, that recognition itself is significant. It is not nothing. It is the beginning of a different kind of attention, turned inward, honest and patient. The slow collapse described in the title of this book is real. Many have lived it, many are living it now. But a collapse, by its nature, implies a structure that was there before the falling. And in examining what fell and why and how, one discovers something essential about what was built, and what might be built differently, more honestly, more durably in its place. There is no clean ending to offer here, no moment at which the work is complete and the quiet is guaranteed, but there is something perhaps more valuable, the understanding that the exhaustion you have felt is not a character flaw, the collapse was not a failure, and the self that emerges from honest engagement with this experience is not diminished. It is, quietly and genuinely, more whole. Thank you for this shared journey through these pages. Follow the Stillness Audiobooks channel to continue exploring. New original audiobooks every week, crafted for the quiet hours, the long drives, the evenings when the mind needs somewhere unhurried to rest.